I'm going to probably leave it to you guys in the first kind of question to introduce yourself and your practices. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited that there are so many people here. Welcome to our panel discussion this morning. As Priya said, I'm Shauna Thompson, and I'm really delighted to be here to participate in this conversation. Just to briefly connect with the land acknowledgement that Ryan gave earlier, I think, within and among all the conversations that we're going to have over the next couple of days, I just really encourage all of us to take time during these days, as we should every day, to reflect on the relationships to this place and to the people who have lived here and continue to live here. And I hope that these kinds of conversations can be kind of a living and enduring part of the work that we're all called to do to address our responsibilities to the land and the city that we live in, and to each other. So just to kind of say that and keep those thoughts in mind as we're talking about, work that really addresses place and addresses one another. We have a really incredible breadth of experience on this panel today, and I feel like this will be a really interesting discussion that will cover a lot of territory, so I'll do my best to keep us on time. I was hoping maybe we could leave 10 minutes or so at the end for questions, so we'll try to do that. So my background is as a curator of contemporary art, and what that means for me, kind of in a nutshell, is that I work with artists in the context of a gallery to talk about and think about their ideas, and to work with a team to produce physical exhibitions of an artist's work. But another really important part of that for me is not only the physical, but really thinking about how to implement strategies to communicate an artist's ideas and to connect those ideas to an audience. I became really interested in public art through this idea of connecting art to audience, to quote, a public or a community. In the field of contemporary art, we talk about that a lot. We like to say things like art is for everybody, or public art for the public good. We talk about the public and the community and the city and what art can or should do for these things. I'm really interested in questioning these types of statements. What are their intentions? What do they really mean? What do they do? And how do they connect or not connect people to art, ideas, and place? It has also been the really complex relationship between art and the public that was at the core of my engagement of public art in Calgary, which Sue kind of alluded to, specifically through the co-founding of the advocacy group Calgary's Public Art Alliance. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the contested space that is public art in this city, which arguably reached its real frothing peak with the sort of hue and cry of a small minority of very vocal people and the conservative media amplifiers around Traveling Light, otherwise known as the Big Blue Ring, which is an artwork that I really love, by the way. Just putting that out there. And Beaufort Towers. The kind of controversy that resulted caused the freeze of the public art program in Calgary, the Civic Public Art Program in 2017, which ultimately led to the program being shifted to a third party or an arm's length organization to manage it, which is the Calgary Arts Development Authority, and that's where the kind of Civic Public Art Program resides at this point. So all of this, the whole context of this was really fascinating and really infuriating to me as a cultural worker in this city. But I think it's a really rich territory, and it's part of a larger context of which BUMP is a part that brings together kind of the three pillars of our panel discussion today, which is public art, participation of people, and the city or the urban landscape. So to consider the complex and vibrant interconnections of these three things, BUMP has brought together this really interesting panel. Unfortunately, Drew Farrell couldn't be here today. She is under the weather. But we have Alana Bartol, who's right next to me, an artist and an educator. At the end, we have Johnny Hare, an architect with a background in the arts. And in the sort of middle, Jasmine Pilardi, who is a community builder and placemaker. And there are also many other things. That's just like a really brief glance. But they will talk about their experience more as we get into it. So let's jump into some questions as a kind of deeper introduction. Can you each talk about your experience and your relationship to public art or art in public space in Calgary or work outside of Calgary? And in your work, how do you think about art in relation to the context of the city? And how do you define or consider community in relation to public art? Who wants to go first?
All right, okay. Thank you, and I think also a really fantastic introduction, adding context to this conversation, but also really setting the table for why I think that bump is really remarkable and a major force of transformation in the city. I mean, what better canvas for the future of our city than the urban fabric? I think that's really, really cool. So, for me, I'm not an artist, but I am arts adjacent. I'm a huge supporter, and I believe that our cities are made better and more ingenious when we unleash creativity in as many spaces as possible and allow for a lot of freedom to do that. And I think where I also just really started to unlock my own thinking about this was many moons ago when I lived in San Francisco. And in that world, similar to what they touched on in us being here in this building today, is that there was a real blend of the technical communities, engineering and arts and innovation, all blended together. And when I moved back to Calgary, because this is where I'm born and raised, and came back here, all I could think about is what role I could play in turning the city inside out to show the creative DNA that exists within our arts and culture scene. And so I've really been committed over my last kind of 15 years of my career in helping to do my best to create sandboxes and canvases for artists and creators and community builders to show the personalities, multiple personalities of various spaces in our cities, because that's where belonging comes from and that's where community dialogue comes from. And I think sometimes in our cities, the algorithm drives us and we start creating these really kind of homogenous spaces that look the same. And to me, public arts breaks that wall, and I think reminds us that there are many different facets and perspectives that we need to weave together to live in a place together.
I'll go next, I guess. So for me, through the lens of an architect, I always try to attack it through the idea of scale. And I think public art has an incredible way, especially Bump in particular, of attacking the ideas of scale within our public realm. I had the fortunate of going to Emily Carr for my undergrad. I gained a lot of really incredible respect for the artists that I was going to school with at the time. And through architecture, we tend to look at the public realm. We try to expand our reach as we do projects and try to take in the context. But I think when I was going to school, I remember going to the De Young Museum in San Francisco and was struck with the Goldsworthy piece at the front door, which is this subtle public art piece. It's actually a crack that starts at the curb and leads you to the front door. And that really, that level of engagement of scale, which then you put that against some of the pieces that Bump is producing within our city, which I think are fantastic because they create these moments of joy and wonder, as we move through our city. So I can't wait to see the new pieces and explore our city after this festival. But from my perspective, the idea of scale and the way that artists can tackle it and make you question really where you are in a community and the stories that it can tell is really my kind of driving force on it.
Yeah, I'm an artist and an educator, and a lot of my artwork, I have an interdisciplinary practice, so I don't work in any specific medium. My work could take the form of a sculpture or an installation or a video or a series of photographs, but in the public art realm, a lot of my work is participatory, so it's really relying on the participation of an audience or a community. Sometimes that's collaborative, sometimes I kind of set up the parameters for participation to occur. So thinking about these questions around community and context and space and histories and who engages in dialogue in public spaces, where do those dialogues happen. These are all things I really think a lot about in my practice. So there's a lot of research that goes into the projects. They're often durational, and they're also often collaborative with other artists. Before I moved to Mohkinstsis, Calgary, I was based in Windsor, Ontario, where they don't have a public art program there. So a lot of the projects that I was doing that were taking place as public artworks were kind of initiated by myself and other artists, sometimes through the invitation of like a curator. So a lot of my public art is not permanent. It's not intended to be kind of an object that exists in public space for a long time. It could be a kind of a walk. It could be an event, a performance, these more kind of ephemeral ways of engaging people. And I really think a lot about the context. And I think that public art can create a social context. I think that in trying to define community, we can, instead of trying to nail down a definition, really think about it as evolving and fluid, and to think about the ways that we sometimes put boundaries around this idea of community and what it can be, and that community can be formed through specific experiences. I also think about more than human communities in my work, because a lot of my work looks at our relationship with the environment. I'm interested in histories of colonization and also how resource extraction impacts the landscape and how that impacts our bodies and the bodies of plants and wildlife and animals. So I think, the idea of community is interesting, especially when we really start to open that up and not just think about human communities as the only communities impacted.
Yeah, that's why I was, trying to kind of put these terms in sort of air quotes, because I think they're definitely worth unpacking. I think we like to think about, community as this kind of monolithic thing, right? Like everybody's part of the community. But, as we kind of think more about this, that breaks down kind of more and more, and it becomes a little bit more sometimes fragmented, sometimes contingent and fluid. So I think that's a really great point. Could you each talk about, maybe just kind of drill down into a project that you've either worked on or that you've experienced here or elsewhere that you feel is particularly strong or successful in connecting with community/communities and or addresses the context of the urban landscape in a way that really stands out to you? And like, what makes that kind of stand head and shoulders above the plethora of other things in the world?
Alana, as the artist, I'm really curious what you want to talk about.
Yeah, I did bring a few images, so I don't know if we could pull up maybe I think that's Shauna's images. Keep going. These are great images, though.
I have some images.
Oh, yeah. This is a slide. So, yeah, I could talk briefly about a project I worked on. So it's one of the images there is through a project I did in collaboration with Camille Turner, who is an artist based in Toronto and LA. The project took place in 2014 in Windsor, Ontario, and it took the form of a walk. It was called Landscape of Forgetting, and we worked on this project for about 8 months, I would say. And Camille was brought to Windsor through a artist residency program called Neighborhood Spaces, which was a socially engaged artist program that was bringing in artists from other cities, but also supporting local artists to really embed them in different sites within the city, and allow them to look at that context, look at the history of that site, think about social, political, cultural contexts. And so Camille was really interested in working with the Windsor Community Museum. At the time, The museum was in the Bobby House, which had been a wealthy French family that was a prominent family in Windsor. And so this was where the community museum was situated. Through her research on histories of enslaved people in what is now called Canada, she had uncovered that the Bobby family had enslaved people in their household. So this was a fact that was not even, you couldn't even read about it at the museum, and it wasn't talked about. And so I was actually the residency coordinator at the time for that program. We ended up working really closely and collaborating on this project. I left the position due to various reasons, but we continued to work on this project, and it really opened up conversations within the museum and the community around histories of slavery in Canada, which is not something that is taught in school. It's not something that's talked about. It's something that a lot of people still don't know about. The museum was extremely resistant to having this history incorporated into the museum itself. And so, and I think we'll talk about this more, but it really became extremely difficult to be embedded in this site. So we left the site and we started talking to community members about this, and we started meeting with people. We found out that community members had documents within their own families that they were trying to grapple with that showed that their families had enslaved people, had owned slaves, and they had tried to bring these documents to the museum, and the museum refused them. So, it started opening up these conversations. The project started getting some press locally. We started doing talks, and it led to the development of this walk. And so there was a symposium with the residency program, and we took all of our research and we put it into this walk. And about maybe like 40 to 50 people came, and we also engaged the participants in the walk in the actual research. So I think art can be a really incredible way to make history kind of, become tangible in different ways, become alive to people, to think about the ways that it can create experiences that incorporate all of the senses. And so by physically bringing people into the museum, talking about this history that wasn't acknowledged, and then bringing them also out into the streets, bringing them to the Detroit River, bringing in community members who sang and spoke during the walk. It was very powerful. So I'm really interested in art that can, it's not necessarily going to be accepted by everyone, and that it was disrupting the status quo. And also, that walk is there. It continues to exist online as a document. We gave it to the museum. It could be taken up and incorporated at any point in time. So I also think a lot about sort of legacy and how that can be given to a community, and who will kind of steward that legacy, and who will be interested and who won't be interested, and who will kind of reject it in different ways.
Me? Okay, I'll go next. My projects are, I've had the benefit of working with recently In From the Cold and Home Space. And there was you've probably seen the mural that was put on it last year by, Jackie Comrie. It was a large 15,000 square foot mural. And this project, the mural, I believe, I was just reading again, apologies, but was the context of the mural was transformation, creation, and our ancestors. And this mural is on the side of a transitional housing piece and temporary housing, but I think the greater conversation that we had when we were developing this project is that it was actually a abandoned office building that we transformed into this space, which kind of has a narrative of transformation with it as well. And from our very first conversation with the client, we actually saw this big wall, which was adjacent to a parking lot. It was in an area that didn't have a lot of occupation. And we showed from day one, we just showed an image on the side of this building. And the idea of that just continued to grow as the project grew. And we were facing challenges as we moved through this project of how do we take an office building and make it a home? We were challenging that narrative from the inside as well as the outside. We based a lot of our interior design around trauma-informed design, knowing that people who are showing up at this door are, they need help and they need it now. It also created some housing above, which people will live there there's no set time. So people are going to call this place a home. And through that transformation, we took little cues on the outside of the building. There's little moments of color. The idea there is that somebody can look up to that window and know that that window is their window because of the color that indicates it. And it also creates activation on the outside of the building. But Jackie Comrie then took this whole facade, which is 15,000 square feet. It's incredible when you're riding along the C train and you see this graphic image on the side of the building. And it made me so happy as an architect because from day one, we had this image as this placeholder. And then she made it reality, which just created so much more richness and texture. And it spoke to the idea of transformation of people within that building, obviously, what they're faced with, but the transformation of that neighborhood. We took a building that had a history of, it was one of the first oil companies in Calgary, and now to transform that building into a place of refuge, a place of rebirth, a place that people could now go and kind of start fresh was an incredible narrative that she then continued into that art piece. Another work that we're working on right now, it's coming out of the ground in the Beltline. It's the Red's Diner site on 4th Street. It's called 4th Street Lofts. You'll kind of see it taking shape. When we first arrived at that site, it had some incredible buildings that existed on that site. And one of them had a piece on it called After the Flood by James Wiper. It was a great piece. I was in love with it. We actually, and we engaged James and talked to him about, because we were redeveloping the site, and we managed to keep the Red's Diner on the corner, which I'll credit the developer. They went through extreme efforts to keep that building, and it was not financially responsible to keep that building, but they did it for the sense of the community. And when we tackled that project, we immediately, from day one, started to have conversations about where can we make these interventions again. And so we had the ability through, as you mentioned before, the public art program is kind of at a standstill. So we wanted to, there's two ways to policy within a city. There's the carrot and the stick. And the stick doesn't get very far with developers. They tend to push back. And again, just through my lens of being an architect, the carrot is much better. What will they get in return? And so I won't dive into all the policy pieces, but there's things where, there's mechanisms where they can get things in return for spending money on things. And so we actually worked the system a little bit and took what was supposed to be spaces that were on horizontal surfaces and actually flipped them to spaces that were on vertical surfaces, and worked with the city and got those vertical surfaces approved as part of the development permit, that those vertical surfaces would now be publicly accessible private open space. So this is space that now exists and will have to exist with artwork on it as part of the approval of the project. And the developer gets the benefit of getting extra density for that space, but the public space now has in perpetuity vertical surfaces that will have public artwork on them. So we were pretty happy with ourselves when we did that, that we were able to work the system to give the owner what they wanted, but also to give the benefit of the neighborhood, the community, And James Wiper is engaged. He sends us an email every few months saying, "Are you ready yet? Are you ready yet?" And we actually carved out where James had signed the original building, and he wrote after the flood. We carved that chunk out of the building before it was demolished, and we have that piece to carry forward as part of the story. So there's always going to be development. I think it's how we can respond and how we can celebrate the stories that were there, continue to tell them, and support our public art in that process.
That's a cool story. I literally about 2 nights ago was standing in front of Reds on 4th, looking at that building and looking beyond it and kind of thinking it's a really nice visual of like yesterday and tomorrow in one little place. So it's a really nice story to hear.
Yeah, it's been an incredible project. Actually, I'll give you one more tidbit on that one. We have, I'll tell you. On the 27th floor on the north side of the building, at the very top, there's actually going to be a graffiti space up there on the 27th floor where a graffiti artist will be able to do a work on the very top of the building, which we thought would be an interesting intervention and create a calling card for the building. But yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think to just add an additional perspective, you spoke a little bit around the ability for public art to, I think, also like invoke conversations and especially histories that were like extractive into more communities that are a bit more regenerative. And I think that that's really important. And I think you also spoke to this notion that there's the ability for public art to breadcrumb us towards things, but also be a beacon when it's like of scale. And so when I think about a few projects that I've been involved in or some that I admire, and I see myself as someone who creates the sandbox or sets a table for artists and creators. And so, in like 2012, 2013, so many moons ago, we worked with a female artist collective out of the Bay Area, and we brought them here to Calgary, and we installed a 3-story tall rocket ship in Victoria Park. And it was a place where everything could be touched. You could climb up inside of it. And the goal was just allow people to remember and unleash themselves that they can play in public space, they can touch things, that not everything is precious, and that everything kind of belongs to us. And the lovely thing is that, we then worked with that female, metalworking collective to then host a all-girls engineering and arts workshop. And girls around 12 years old built flamethrowers, which was a totally fun thing. They're not allowed to use them outside now, but that's okay. And I just think about this ability for art in our shared spaces to spur not only dialogue, but also encourage new kind of muscle memory and motor skills with us to interact with each other in our environment. And often I see public art, whether temporary or permanent, as an ability to just kind of like put out the invitation. This place belongs to you too. And to me, a measure of success of any art or placemaking project is dwell time. Are people hanging out here longer than they did before? And then ideally, even if we can just kind of casually observe, are they making net new social connections while we're here? Because I think so often in the world of city making and placemaking and urban design, which again I'm adjacent to, is the scorecards for success are around transactions. But transactions are also social. It's not necessarily cost per square foot on that 27th floor, which no doubt is going to go up for a developer if actually they take that lower level at the sidewalk and make it permeable with the community, make it a really cool place to hang out, and ensure that as personality by inviting artists and creators and local entrepreneurs in, they're going to get more money on that top floor. Absolutely they will. But creating those opportunities for looking at the social interactions and social cohesion and safety and desirability of a place that's more enduring, I think is really a catalyst that public art can serve. And so I think there's that. And one other just really quick example, and it's not one of mine, but it's one I go back to all the time, is the designer Thomas Lomé. He was invited by the University, I think, of Delft in Belgium to create a mural during a climate summit. And it's the most simple mural in the world. It's white with just black lettering, and it says, the next big thing is a lot of small things. And suddenly, it just created this mind shift, an entire area within that city to start thinking differently about that place, not only in actions around climate, but in also who belongs in those places and what we're allowed to do. And we don't have to wait for someone else to come in with the next big policy or investment, but we can start to make really incremental, cool moves towards great places.
Thank you. In listening to you talk, Johnny, I'm really sad that Drew isn't here because I'm really interested and I don't really know that much about policy and planning in relation to art. I do know that often if developers commit to having sort of art spaces or some kind of cultural element of their development, they will get easement, they can add extra floors, whatever. But I'm really curious about this. It sits sometimes really uncomfortably with me because I worry about art becoming instrumentalized in these ways. And I'm just throwing this out here as like a thing. Maybe it kind of seems bratty, or maybe somebody in the audience has something to contribute to this, but I live in Ramsey and I work in Inglewood, and something I've been really thinking about recently is, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the Blues Can, the music venue. So the Blues Can is slated to be demolished. I guess the land has been owned by Battistella for many years, and I think they've been maybe subsidizing the rent for the Blues Can for a while. So it kind of complicates the story. But so, they're intending to build, your classic mixed use, like retail on the bottom, condos on the top, in the name of, densifying the downtown core. Great, but who can afford these spaces? And of course, the community is really upset that they're going to be losing this artistic cultural space for live music performance. And Battistella, at least in the images that I have seen, the building will be called Blues by Battistella, which is kind of like a dagger to the heart. And then they've committed, they're like, don't worry, there will be a memorial plaque memorializing the Blues Can, and we'll put a mural on the building memorializing this space. And to me, it is such a fucking slap in the face. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear, but I don't know, and I'm not sure if they're getting anything from that or if that's just a gesture. But that really pisses me off that art and public space can kind of get utilized in this way, but you're losing a really vibrant cultural space in a community, and it's something that makes the neighborhood unique, and people go there, and I don't know, it's such a shitty trade-off.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Thankfully, that's not my project. Make this super awkward. But no, it's something that I think we often struggle with. As architects, we are a service industry, and but we also try to tell stories along the way. I don't know the details of that project, and it's a struggle. I think it was something that we were faced with the Red Steiner site, which is why the owner, who has a long-standing history in Calgary, really wanted to ensure that stayed and that was celebrated. The whole project was designed around that building, so it is something that we're constantly faced with. And I will say, on other projects, maybe not that one or even 4th Street Lofts, the struggle with a lot of the developers through the public art program is, I think, due to the conservative kind of base around public art, that when they go into these policy-driven pieces where if you invest so much in public art, then you get this back. But that public art is then put to a group that then determines what that public art is, which you can understand from a developer perspective, that frightens them, right? So because they no longer have control of what that art could be. So there's other mechanisms where they like to explore the idea of, and many of the developers want that collaboration, but there's a bit of a disconnect there. They kind of have to sign a check and just hand it over and then be happy with whatever shows up, which can be a bit unnerving for, and I hate to say it, but there's big companies, big mutual funds that own these buildings, and so
they're
it's
not local.
And they're not local, so it is a constant struggle and something that we're faced with.
I think that dovetails really nicely into my next question, and Sue kind of gestured to this in her keynote. But really thinking about the conversation around public art in Calgary over the last decade in particular, as I kind of outlined, there has been a lot of rhetoric around what art should do. And I think it's situated in that kind of, a lot of times the conversation's situated in that kind of like apprehension. So just thinking about, for example, former councillor Shane Keating said at the time of the public art program being frozen, where we have to get is to art that is acceptable. And then broadly, there were several quotations from councillors, including one who isn't here today, fretting about art that the public doesn't like. I'm interested in pushing against this idea that art should serve and placate a status quo, that it should be decorative, pleasant, seamless. I think Sue talked about neutrality. I want to talk about the possibility of art in public space as a counter to that, and as a kind of disruption. Does it resonate with you in your work? How within set structures or processes can we or should we work to foster the possibility of something that may be disruptive or even difficult?
I'm super curious.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I'm wondering if we can show an image. It's of a piece that Annie Wong did. So next slide, next. Thank you. So I really wanted to talk about a piece by Annie Wong, and Sue already mentioned Annie Wong, spoke about her work in her keynote. So when Shauna was posing these questions around disruption, I immediately thought of Annie Wong's piece, A Park Without a Name, because I think it really illustrates how public art can be disruptive. This piece was only up for 4 days. So I think the extremely short amount of time that this banner piece was allowed to exist in the city, really speaks to that idea of the fear that was developed around this piece. So just to kind of explain a little bit of background, this was a public art commission from the City of Calgary for the renaming process of the park formerly known as James Short. The park was named after a white lawyer and school principal who was instrumental in attempting to prevent Chinese Calgarians from establishing the city's Chinatown. And it's located downtown on 4th Street. I was able to see this piece in person. I ran down to the park to see it because I thought it was so powerful, and I couldn't believe that it was only going to be up for 4 days. And she developed this piece through the Chinatown Artist Residency, which was through the City of Calgary in partnership with the New Gallery. And so through that residency, Wong was able to interview Chinatown residents about their thoughts about Short and also their thoughts on the renaming process itself. And so some of the other banners, I just have the one image. Some of the sayings were erasing a name and history does not erase what was done. Time doesn't heal anything. It just makes a generation forget. And there are several others, so I just encourage everyone to go online and look into this piece. I believe the banners were put into the City of Calgary Public Art Collection. I'm not sure, I don't know if anyone knows about that, but I'd be really interested to know because I hope they will be put out in public space again. So I think these really invite us to consider whose voices, whose histories, whose names are and language too are valued when we place names in spaces, when we name spaces. And it really makes transparent not only the racist past, but present as well, and just the fear of having these kinds of conversations. I also think it's a real testament to the trust the artist was able to establish with the community, and the process that they were able to engage the community in, which was a dialogical process. And I'm really interested in dialogical aesthetics, which is something art theorist and scholar Grant Kester writes a lot about in public art and community art. And I think the choice to create these banners and to include English and traditional Chinese languages in public space at this location. And if you've been to the park, it's kind of a circle. So you're literally surrounded by these banners. And it's almost like it's reclaiming the space, it's enclosing the space. I think it just speaks to a really powerful statement to make about the city. So yeah.
I think you pointed to something that's really key, and that's the dialogue that can come. And my take on someone who likes to invite artists in but then build programming around is that programming, instead of setting the conversation, is really key. And we've seen the backlash of what happens when we don't allow for dialogue, or just assume that decent dialogue is going to happen, and yes, some people are going to like things and some people are not going to like things, but goodness gracious, there can be a small minority that just makes everyone afraid of the next thing. And that's what's happened in so much of society. And I think that our cities as a whole, as someone who plays a lot of emphasis on future of our cities, is that we are, as communities and as cities, kind of going through an existential crisis moment. We're really asking ourselves what's next for the places in which we share and we live, and how do we live together, especially in places that are embracing more diversity, that are increasingly becoming more diverse. And art allows us to ask big questions, and we live in a society, and big questions should be something we're all good at, but we're not great at it. And so I believe in the power of programming, and I know that there's a number of people in this room who play the role of a programmer next to a curator. And it's our role as programmers to set those conversations in motions and to create spaces where multiple perspectives can come together, and do as good a job as we can to make what I call prickly conversations comfortable to have. We're never going to get to consensus, but we can get towards alignment around shared values. And so when we can leverage public art, be it temporary or permanent, to spark a conversation, but look at our roles as guides for that conversation, because then what we're not necessarily doing is we're not necessarily trying to be antagonists. And there's a role for that, right? There's a role to kind of be that rough sandpaper to expose things. But if we also kind of create some space around and some structure to allow for conversations, then we're inviting everyone in. And sometimes I think we can do the opposite by trying to have an important conversation, but accidentally othering. And then what we end up with sometimes is ramifications where some of that kind of social license for the next thing kind of gets revoked. And so to me, the more we can really lean into active programming around these things and invite as many voices in is really key. And that's why I think it's super exciting. I've been on tours with Bump before and an artist talk, and I think to then start to have a conversation and a conference, it's just talking about how important dialogue is. But we need something at the center of it. And to me, the art plays that role.
To build on that too, one thing I've learned as an architect is that you can't please everyone. And I think that idea, that uncomfortable nature that people don't want to face the fact that you're maybe not going to all like the same thing, but that it might spur questions. I don't think a lot of people are faced with that on a daily basis, whereas artists or people in the creative world, you're constantly faced with criticism of your work. And I feel that people struggle with that outside of the creative world, that you're not going to please everybody. And the idea that public art challenges, I love the blue ring too, just for the record, because anybody who ever comes to visit, it's the first thing they want to bring up. But it's, that idea of, and I don't think it necessarily has to be criticism, it's the idea of wonder. Art brings wonder, it can bring joy, but it can bring wonder, and wonder can be through so many different forms. It's curiosity. And I think if our built environment can start to make people more curious about where they live, the community they live in, the stories that were told there, the stories that built it, and if art can help tell that story, and the built environment can help tell that story, then that's...
Yeah, these are all really great points. It's something I think about a lot, and I think contemporary art could be its own worst enemy sometimes. And some of the sort of phrases I was talking about at the beginning, like this idea that art's for everyone, and I mean even working in a gallery, there's this sort of there's like an implication that because something is shown in a gallery or something is put out in public, that it is good. And it's like, that is good, and you should like it. And if you don't like it or understand it, then there's something wrong with you, is kind of to me, that becomes the sort of negative flip side of these sort of, these kind of phrases that are supposed to be, inclusive and welcoming, but I think they can be really alienating because they don't leave space for feeling bad or not liking something. And I think we've all become really bad at not liking things in our environment. And it's like, it's okay to hate the blue ring. Like, if you guys hate the blue ring, that's great. Like, when I'm at the gallery and somebody comes in and they're like, I hate this work, I don't know, how is this art, whatever, and they engage in that conversation and it's kind of more of a negative, or they're sort of offended, like, I love that. That's more interesting than people who just, like, they come in, cycle around for 30 seconds and then leave. Like, I'd rather have you fired up because it's connecting to something, and that's a good thing in some way. I think, connected to this, and I think with public art, there's often, it feels like there's a lot at stake. They tend to be sort of larger scale projects. There's more money involved. There could, whatever funding body, it could be private money, it could be public money. I think we've all seen the kind of flashpoint of like $1 of the price tag of a public artwork, and people are like, oh my God, how did this $500,000, get given to this artist from New York who's like drinking wine and eating cheese, and this is like, and they, it's like people don't understand the breakdown of where that money actually goes, but it raises the stakes in this way that kind of does a disservice to the whole process. So I'm interested in how, or do you see spaces for failure? I mean, this is kind of connected to these sort of like the difficulty of negative feelings, but what is the space for failure in public art or in the work that you do? Is there any? How do you evaluate that? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Like, what can failure be? And is it all bad? Is it productive? Go.
I can take a quick hot take. So I love failure. I think it's important as a whole. It also creates space for conversation. But I think, especially in the realm of large-scale public art that is big budget, especially because suddenly you have like engineering firms and gigantic cranes and heavy machinery sometimes, it's expensive, which then tends to lead everyone to believe that the stakes are really high. But are the stakes as high as we keep setting them? And so therefore, if the stakes feel high, then suddenly we've got counselors who are looking at perceived public opinion about a work of art through that counselor's perceived potential of loss around losing the next election if people don't like a piece of art. So there's all these bits and pieces that come into play, right, into like the system of thinking around a given piece. And so my hope would be that when we start having these conversations, we do both large scale and kind of incremental artwork around a city, is that we start making space for experimentation, trial and error, successes, failure, which are what we all need anyways, as to like live in a society that tries things. And so I really believe that anytime any of us go into a project, it's like, how do we make space for experimentation? How do we celebrate experimentation? And what are our measures of success? And like those can also include lessons learned. And so my sense is that I think sometimes we treat things as too precious and then think that the stakes are really high, when in fact, if we can create a narrative around any project we're doing to start to make space for learning, I think we can sometimes create a stronger backbone for when a project doesn't necessarily meet everyone's desired outcome.
Yeah, I think failure is, as an artist, it's integral. It's important to the process of making art. Like if you're afraid to fail, then you're going to limit yourself. You're not going to be able to take chances. You're not going to be able to try new things. You're not going to be able to work in new ways or tackle new subjects. So so when I think about failure, I'm always, as a teacher, an instructor, an educator, talking about the importance of failure. So I think it's important. And I think it's important when we're making public art as well, because also I go back to this idea of, well, what is failure? Who's defining what a success and failure is? Did someone decide that Annie Wong's project could potentially be a failure if it was up longer than a few days because someone might not like it, right? Did that project fail because it wasn't able to be in public space for very long, or was that actually a real success of the project and pointing to just how powerful it was? So I think there's interesting questions that kind of get opened up when we start to talk about what failure really looks like and what it means. And again, like that definition might change. And so, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
I have 4 kids, and so I always have to tell them that failure, fail forward, try and learn from your mistakes. The metrics that and I think you touched on this, the metrics that we gauge projects, a project can be a success on so many levels and then fail on so many more. And I really think it comes down to the priorities of that. What is someone's failure is another success. It all kind of sounds a bit corny, but when in our world that I work in, success can be measured on so many different levels, and often the ones that are seen maybe as a success financially fail in the public realm, or things like that. So it's a balance, and I don't know if I necessarily have a clear answer for it, but yeah, I enjoy failure as part of the process, because it's only then that you can kind of take that forward. But
I think I just thought of a couple things in the conversation I wanted to add, is that I think if the artist is not able to maintain the artistic integrity of the project and their idea, that's a failure, And so maybe rather than looking at the art and the artist, maybe we should look at all the systems around the artists that are or are not supporting artistic work in public spaces, right? What are all the limitations that artists have to work within in very bureaucratic systems and institutions that are not allowing them to do the project? Like, as an artist who has been on both sides, I also have done curatorial projects, and I've been an artist, so I'm always thinking about, like, what are the supports that artists need? Can they actually articulate them, and how are those relationships, whether it's with like a public art program or a bump, or the person who's building the mural is going to be on, or the space that you're working within, the community you're trying to connect to. Like, there's so much going on in developing these projects. It's really important that the artist is able to maintain the integrity of their work, develop trust with the community and with the participants, but I don't think they should have to develop the trust of the organization that's bringing them in. That trust should already be there when they chose that artist. Like, that's showing that, you know, they're selecting that artist for their expertise for a specific reason. So as an artist, I shouldn't have to earn the trust of the program or the organization that's bringing me in, if that's the case for a public art project, which often it is, you know. So yeah, I kind of want to flip that idea of failure around a little bit, away from the art itself, and look at all of these things around the art.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, and I was kind of thinking about that as you were all talking, but you know, just thinking about you know, starting from a context and starting from you know, commissioning a work and thinking about the structures of whatever kind of commissioning body that might be, also the process and the timelines. Like, I think a lot about, you know, if we're thinking about failures of public art in the city. From my perception on the outside of those projects, it was sort of, it felt like a lot of the backlash was kind of a lack of communication, or they kind of engaged in this sort of, you know, which you see all over the place, but this kind of like, you pick a spot and you drop a thing on it and it's like, it's public art, and then, but there hasn't been the kind of the relationship building, the time given to bring people kind of into the process and bring them kind of along for the ride, to kind of understand what this is, for there to be some kind of exchange in developing what the work can be. Because I think it feels really, yeah, alienating when something just crops up in your community. And again, it's like you're sort of told, like, you should like it. And it's just like, I hate this thing. And I don't.
You're lucky this is even here.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, people will literally say that, like, oh, you're so privileged that there's this piece of art like in your neighborhood. It's like, well, if I don't have any connection to it, or the artist hasn't been allowed or given the space or part of the process to kind of have that be part of the work. Like, actually, it's not really necessarily about the thing, the outcome, but it's the process of coming to that thing, which, I mean, back to the idea of failure, you know, giving them kind of space and a timeline. Like, failures can happen and they can become productive, I think, in that way.
I don't think we've failed hard enough yet. Like, if the blue ring is the failure, I don't think public art has failed hard enough yet. Like, we need to fail.
That's the only reference that comes
Yeah,
to
like, if that's the bookend, then we need to fail harder so that we can actually test things out in the public space more.
Fail harder.
Yeah, we need to fail harder.
That should be the new slogan. Kata, are you listening? Fail harder.
Try more things.
I think, you know, kind of connected to this idea of timeline, actually, let me just check the time here. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. I'm also really interested, I mean, we're talking a lot about, you know, public art as something kind of permanent, monumental, although, Elena, you've talked about some really interesting projects that aren't that. You know, you kind of think about the classic commemorative bronze statue, and, you know, I remember when, you know, all the brouhaha was going on, you know, about public art in Calgary. I believe it was Mayor Nenshi who said, you know, it would just be really nice if we could just go back to having more statues of guys and gals on horses, as if that would kind of take care of the controversies. Like, everybody loves an equestrian statue, and then, you know, fast forward to 2020 and the rise of Black Lives Matter, and then across the world people are tearing down equestrian statues. So this idea of like, oh, the bronze, the monumental, this is the safe space of no failure, everybody gets it, it's fine. But I guess, like, I just sort of wanted to talk about art that is sort of temporary or durational, you know, an idea of like a performance. And what do you think temporary work can contribute to our public spaces, urban development, and sort of a development of civic dialogue?
Well, I'm really glad you brought up that quote. Can we go through my slides? There's an image that I really want to show because it just connects so well. It's a piece by, keep going, and this one. Nope, go back, right there. So this is a piece by Life of a Craphead, which is a artistic duo, Amy Lamb and John McCurley. This was a piece in Toronto. So it was a a replica that the artist made of a statue of King Edward VII. It's an equestrian. It's the classic, colonial bronze equestrian statue that is in a park in Toronto, and they toppled it. And this is before everyone else started. This is before colonial statues were being toppled. So I think it's just a really amazing example of a temporary public artwork that is addressing this idea that public art needs to be permanent and monumental and also celebrate colonial histories. And they did a performance where each week for a month they would float the statue down the Don River. And there was a lot of public outcry, and also they the program, I heard sort of through conversations that the word colonial, even using the word colonial to talk about this work at the time, was considered extremely controversial. So I think a lot has changed, obviously, since this project happened, but I think it really shows how artists are looking to the future. They are talking about some of the most important issues of our time, and they can do it in ways that are really unexpected. And also humor can be a really powerful tool in artwork as well. And yeah, I'll end it there. So
I can speak to a little bit of temporary nature, and it's funny because I struggle for myself to call it art, and simply because I don't consider myself an artist. So last year we were asked by the City of Calgary's downtown strategy team to create some spaces downtown with this urban kind of futures festival, and so we called it Lobby Fest. And the first question we had at that time was, one, again, every downtown is struggling with the future of its downtown. I think we talked a little bit about that even in the opening. If we're not all coming to our second places of work, what is a downtown office tower for? But also that notion of these semi-public but also private and policed lobby spaces where if you stay for longer than 15 minutes, someone might kind of stand over your shoulder and nudge you along. And so how do we re-envision these spaces? And then therefore, how do we re-envision downtown? So we created this temporary, I'll call it community engagement installation. And we combined AI as well as crowdsourcing, the imaginations of Calgarians to ask them, what do you see as the future of downtown? And so we combined both of these, and then we ended up kind of like a Willy Wonka ticket. We put 5,000 different futures about downtown into 5,000 biodegradable balloons and installed them in a lobby downtown. And it sat there for a week, and at the end of this lobby fest that we did, people came and popped them in one big pop moment. And it was kind of akin to when you burn the man at Burning Man. It was very cathartic and loud, these 5,000 balloons popping in a short period of time. But I think what it did as a temporary piece is it allowed people to kind of submit their own idea, but then also see other ideas and start to interact with them. And these cards were passed around between people after the big pop moment. And a conversation could ensue. And you could start to see the similar themes around values and desires that people wanted. And it was really more around more human spaces, more art. Everyone said more art. Everyone said more art. And kind of unleashing that community. And my sense is that when we put something out there in a temporary way and we invite people to participate in it, we create a sense of shared ownership. And we can kind of be moment makers. And when we are moment makers, I think that there's ripple effects that happen for a long time afterwards, which are really great, even if something only is there for a brief moment of time, whether it's a performance or a piece, but they're such awesome elements of surprise. I think that are really beautiful.
Was that in the ampersand?
It was.
That's one of my projects. There you go.
Oh,
Hey. I have a huge appreciation for temporary art. I don't know how it influences necessarily what I do every day. I do remember, and I apologies to all the artists in the room, because when I was going to art school, we had this guest speaker one time. He was a German fellow, And I wish I could remember his name. I even looked through my sketchbooks to try and find his name. But he came and he spoke about his public artwork where he was commissioned to do a fountain. And so he stacked a whole bunch of barrels in the middle of the city and shot them with a gun. And then all the water came out. He also did another public artwork where he took the money and was a public employee for a year on their roads crew, and that was his public art.
That's awesome.
So I love kind of that level of narrative in my own, like just my own personal side of things. But the temporary side, I think, is interesting for the work that Bump is doing, because through my lens, graffiti art lives in that temporary world, but the work that Bump is creating is so enriched that we actually have, they're redoing the underpass artwork right now over on McLeod Trail South, which I believe was originally done as a Bump artwork. And then it slowly got taken over by graffiti artists again, just due to access and people being able to paint over it right there, which was sad because of the beauty of the work that was there, but also a bit of an evolution of the work that was there. And now it's being repainted again by another Bump artist. I walked by them on the way here. And so I think there's some beauty in the temporal nature that the spaces around us will change. Even the built environments, obviously our lifetime doesn't see, well, or it does, see a lot of change in some areas, and other areas not so much. But yeah, the temporal nature of the work that Bump is doing is I think part of the beauty of it, and why people accept it so much. I think even that conservative side, they accept the fact that it's somewhat temporal, because they know that it could be washed off or it could be painted over, versus a statue, which is very permanent. Anyways, that's my take.
Thank you. My alarm went off. We have about 10 more minutes, so I thought maybe we could switch gears and open it to the audience for questions or comments. Okay, I'm not sure how we want to do this, but first, oh, yeah, okay. Whoa. Oh, whoa.
Got a little catch box here, so just raise your hand, I'll throw it right to you.
Ooh, well, this is exciting.
Alright, so the first hand is there. I'm not going to throw that one.
Well, I can say from my perspective, get involved with your community association. Projects that we do, any public project, always gets circulated to the community association. So the community you live in, if you volunteer at that association, you'll have a say in every project that comes into your community. So and by the time it reaches that point, there's still opportunity to have influence. So for what I do, that would be the best time.
Yeah. Hey, Amy. I think so interestingly enough, I think about forums like Detox or others that are actually building community, and I think that's really important. So I think there's two things. One is engaging with existing communities and finding the way, depending on the project, how early in the process, because if you want to say that you're co-creating with, then you have to co-create with. If you're saying that we are informing, then we are informing. So I think part of it is the purpose of engaging with community. And then there's the other side, and because it's a spectrum, is really engaging with and kind of listening and learning with community and kind of inviting them into the process. So my sense is it's typically always a spectrum, but most things are successful when you start to build and engage community earlier in the process. Yeah, almost always.
Yeah, I would say from the perspective as an artist, it depends on the project, but and I think the approach of the artist. And so again, I go back to this question of like, well, what does community mean? There could be multiple communities, right? There could be a community that the artist is directly working with, and as part of their research, maybe to understand, to even come up with the idea for the artwork and the form it's going to take. But there might be community that is participating and co-creating. There's community that will experience the work, that maybe lives near the site where it's located, or moves through that site or works there. Then there could be communities from outside of the city that come and visit. There could be also plant communities, et cetera, more than human communities. So I think it's really important to think about all of these kinds of questions as early as possible, and especially a lot of the artworks that I create and that I showed today, they're really responding to the site, right? And they're really trying to do a deep dive into the social context and really understand that and understand social, political, cultural context of a place. And in order to do that, I think it's, you must connect with different communities that have connections to that place, but they might not always be the most visible or obvious communities.
Just to build on that, I completely agree. And I think artists are often brought into the process way too late. And so I think sometimes if you're thinking about commissioning something, I have these conversations with friends a lot where we don't really think about artists or creative workers in the same way that we think about engineers or other people. So if you're going to bring an artist in to do a project in a city, why are they not at the table at the first moment of kind of conceiving what this new development thing could be? Because I think artists bring a perspective and a way of engaging with the world that can be a huge contribution to just the origin of a project, and then something can kind of come from that. So I'd say right at the beginning, have them sitting around the design, the concept table if you can. We should have artists everywhere in every department of the city, in my opinion. Anyway.
And also they need to be paid.
Pay them. Pay artists. Yes, artists are experts. Artists and cultural workers are also experts, and they deserve to get paid to be consulted. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to do some kind of jury work or consulting work for free, and it's not acceptable. Mic drop. Let's go. All right, next question.
I think that's a great question, and it's really important. And I think I just go back to looking at the artist that, either you're an artist or you're bringing in an artist, and it's looking at how does that artist work? What is their process? Would they be interested? How do we create opportunities and invitations for artists to come in to be able to understand a context, to be able to do that really important work, to know how to approach, making the work itself, and how to create a process. I think all the projects I looked at, and some I wanted to talk about and wasn't able to, but the artists working in public space are very process driven, and they do research. Artists, you have to trust artists. That's another maybe slogan we need to have, because if you select an artist to work with or invite an artist into the community to start conversations, you have to develop trust with them that they know what they're doing and that they're going to be able to find those contacts in the community. But also, that goes back to this important point around the support structures, right? And so are there key people in the community that might be a really good connection point, or maybe a bridge? Artists can be a bridge too, and I think artists can be that bridge between different communities, between sites and people and ideas, etc. But yeah, there can be a lot of, I think, ways and conversations to make sure that communities and people are able to create spaces where they feel like their voices can be heard.
Yeah, and I'd say it's about relationship building, and it kind of goes back to, in a way, that process, giving time. I mean, you often hear projects moving at the speed of trust. You can't go in or try to work with a community and say well, we need X, Y, Z to happen, by this date or whatever. That's just not, especially if it's some community that maybe has been hurt before. You know what I mean? I think there has to be a real kind of consideration to it will take the time that it takes, and really approaching it with a like building relationships with actual people, and also, I think just like what's the intention behind the project, and like what is the work, and who is the work for, and like how does that kind of manifest? I think has to also be really considered.
Yeah, and I would echo that the idea, we do a lot of engagement depending on the different type of projects we work on. If it's a school, or if it's a rec center, or if it's a lot of public buildings. And that level of trust is something that has to be built over time. I would say start with food. That always is the food is a great gathering piece for people, but it's having people feel that they have a voice that's heard, but also a voice that can have influence over what's happening. If it's seemed upon to be just ticking a box in the process, and it's not genuine, then I think it's you won't get the engagement that you actually want. We were fortunate to work on a library, the Airdrie Library, and we did some engagement there. And as part of that engagement, we made verbal notes, but we actually brought in an artist to do basically an artist representation of our engagement. And that was really meaningful because it kind of spoke to the level of trust that we were trying to build, and just made a representation rather than here's our notes from the meeting, but here was more of a graphic piece that people could respond to, and it emulated more than what the words I think ever could.
Okay, we are at 12 o'clock. How do we feel? Do we end? Do we do one more question? I need one more question? Okay, one more question. Sorry, it was like like a project that's inviting other artists to come in and make their own work, like as part of it?
I can touch on a little piece, which might not be a surprising one, but we did a school, and new schools are scary for kids, especially if it takes place of a school that they were used to before. So as part of that process, we engaged with the kids, and they all created artwork that on day one was going to be on the wall, so that when they came into the school, they immediately felt connected that they were there. So it was a way to kind of bridge that gap of this is your new school, because they literally had to witness their old school getting torn down. So it was a nice way to engage them in a meaningful piece that ultimately bridged that gap.
Yeah, that's really nice. We've even done photo walks with communities as well, and allowed them to basically be the lens of a particular place, and then the photo exhibition is then placed often in a public space, whether that's a vacant storefront, whether it's in a gallery or otherwise. And again, too, what it's doing is it's just showing community perspectives, and it's allowing their perspective to then influence a project, which is really cool. Because I think, to your point, having the personality of the people who are there and their lived experiences exude out from a given place or then be placed into something, we start creating a sense of belonging, and that's a really powerful thing. Yeah, the initiative you mentioned sounds really cool. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think there's a couple, there's lots of great books. There's a book, I used to work with the Ontario Arts Council, and they put together a community engaged artist book, and they have case studies in there that kind of go through and explain different approaches to engaging community in art projects. And many of the examples are similar to the project that you're speaking about, where it's really kind of drawing on people who are not artists, but are creating artworks collectively to create a project. So I would definitely recommend that as a really great resource. Two of the projects I didn't kind of talk about, but I think they're really powerful public artworks. One is by C. Swice and Riley, and it's called A Constellation of Remediation. And it's based on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And so with that project, they're creating these remediation gardens in these underutilized and vacant lots. And also in connection with specific Indigenous community groups. And so it's really embedded in public space. It's a 2-year-long project that I believe has been completed now, but it's really drawing on these connection points and creating stronger kind of decolonial practices in public space, and working with those communities and creating these gardens that are actually rooted in Indigenous science and knowledge and culture and healing the land. And I think that's a lot of the projects that I'm really interested in right now are very much collaborations with community members, but really not trying to like, they're drawing on what expertise is already there, right? And really working with them. So that might be another project I would recommend looking at. I'll chat with me after, I'll find the name, but yeah, it's through the Ontario Arts Council, I know. So.
Okay. I think we'll end there. Thank you all so much for being here. To the panelists, amazing input, experience. Just like, it's so interesting to hear from all of your various spheres of experience in talking about this very broad topic. So thank you so much for participating. And thank you, Public Art.